this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the World War II podcast. When I talked to Eric Lee about Operation Foxley, he mentioned that in London was a theatre production of Operation Mincemeat, which was currently running. Eric suggested that the story was so fantastical that the play runs as a comedy, as it's hard to believe that such a scheme could actually be true. Well, that got me thinking. Currently at the Alexandra Palace Theatre this summer is Tom, Dick and Harry, a play telling the story of the Great Escape. I thought it might be interesting to talk about how you take a story so familiar to many of us, growing up watching endless reruns of the film, and change that into a play. And how do you deal with the fantastic, which is true, but on top of that you need to deal with the legend, which might have little in relation to what actually happened. I'm joined by Theresa Heskins. Theresa is the artistic director of the New Vic Theatre and also the writer and director of Tom, Dick and Harry. Thanks for joining me. Now, let's start with the story of Tom, Dick and Harry. I'm sure everyone is familiar, but on the off chance there is somebody who's not, for those not sure of what the story of the Great Escape is, do you want to run us through it?
I don't find it hard to believe because I had heard of it, but I knew nothing about it when I started working on it because I've not seen the films or read any of the books or anything. But essentially, during the Second World War, aircrew who were shot down over occupied Europe were interned in prisoner of war camps in Germany and Poland and possibly other places, but those are the ones I know about. They regarded themselves as still on active service and regarded it as their duty to escape. And so they'd set up groups or organisations or committees. And this particular group that we're interested in, Organisation X, was set up at a camp called Stalag Luft 3, which was in Poland, and was the boldest escape of the lot. Instead of getting out one or two or three people, they aimed to get out 200 people. And about 70 people did manage to escape one night after months and months and months of preparation and an incredible feat of engineering that dug them out. I think what I didn't realise when I started learning about it, I thought that once you managed to achieve that escape under the wire, you were out, you were free. And of course, I didn't realise that then you had to escape occupied Europe. And that was even more of a challenge. And also, I didn't realise, I did know a theme tune, and it's a very jaunty theme tune that I associate with the story of the Great Escape. So I thought it was a massive success story, fantastic, triumphant ending. And then I was told by one of the people that suggested that we make a play about it, that actually 50 people had been shot. Again, I didn't realise at the time, but I learned that this was a war crime. This was against the terms of the Geneva Convention and was so unusual because the Germans had subscribed to the Geneva Convention and were actually quite good at keeping to it. And so it was an extraordinary atrocity. It was reported in Parliament. And 80 years later, I learned people are still talking about it. And there are millions of books about it. And there's a film about it. But my dad, who has never been to the theatre in his life, I've directed about 60 shows, not been able to persuade him to come to any of them, not shown any interest in them. I said to him, I'm doing a play, Dad, about this thing called The Great Escape. Do you know it? And he instantly told me all about it. Most interested he's ever been in theatre. Not interested enough to actually come. But.
Well, you mentioned the film. The film, I hadn't realised. I had to look it up. It's nearly 60 years old. That in itself based on a book that's written in the 50s. So what are you adding with the play to the story? Because the film written in the 60s, there must be a lot of archival information and things like that of subsequently we know. And I mean, I know some of the veterans were not particularly happy with the film, especially the slightly ridiculous Steve McQueen chase sequence, which is completely and utterly dreamt up out of thin air. But what are you adding to the story?
Well, I haven't seen the film, and I've still managed to avoid it. Actually, I know it's unbelievable, isn't it? One day I'm going to sit down and watch it and go, "Oh, right." But my co-writers, Michael Hugo and Andy Pollard, and I we said right at the beginning, how are we going to tell the story? Should we look at a particular account of it? If we do, will we just get one person's view of it? One of the things that we were concluding was that it was an amazing collaborative effort. So we decided that what we'd do was have a look at the archives. I knew that at the National Archives in London, that's where the government keeps all its records, and that I'd find any military or air ministry records there. So we just looked online, to be honest. We booked a reader's ticket. Anybody can do it. They're public records. So you just go online, you book a reader's ticket, and you can order some documents. And then on the day, you turn up and you go through the security checks, which are quite stringent. And then you open the locker you've been given, and in it are the documents you ordered. So we ordered these 5 documents that were waiting for us in the lockers and started reading them. And we learned so much from those documents. We learned all about the daily life of the camp, all sorts of other things. And at the end of it, we realised, well, we can write this play now from these 1,500 pages of documents that we've managed to look at and add some imagination. But essentially what we'll be doing is working with the facts. So really what we're doing is it's not a drama documentary because there is more theatre in it than that. But almost everything in it has come from something that we found in those documents, including the international effort. So people keep telling me that the Americans picked up their role in it, and we discovered that most of the Americans had been moved out of the camp a few months before the escape actually took place. They had contributed a lot to the escape effort because it's a massive effort. But also we learned that some of the Canadians as well had been just as important in that and had also moved out. And we learned that people from all across the world, now I didn't know this, I didn't know that in the camp there were people from representing the global majority from New Zealand, and in other camps there were people from India and parts of Africa. In the camp we were talking about, there were a lot of people from Eastern Europe who'd fled their country and come to serve in the RAF. There was a massive group of people serving in the RAF at this time who have subsequently become known as the pilots of the Caribbean. And I think what really struck us was what an amazing contribution so many countries in the world were making to winning that war in so many ways. 1 in 4 aircrew came from what were then called the Dominions, colonies and former colonies. And we really wanted to tell that story, actually, because we thought that that's something that's not very well known.
So what tidbits did you find in the documents from the archives? Because I know it's frightfully thrilling when you go to the archives. You can sometimes pull out a piece of paper and be dreadfully disappointed at what has the most amazing title, and then you go, oh, that's rubbish. And then something else slips out and you go, oh my God, look, this is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we found, even before we opened a document, the very first one I opened was called Project X, and it was a brief account of the escape. And it had a blue stick on the front that said closed until 1972, and a stamp in red that said top secret. I knew instantly that we were looking there at something that the makers of the film didn't have access to. And so that was really exciting. That's when I thought, oh, right, we are going to get the inside track on this. The next document we opened said closed until 1995. The next was closed until 2035, and the next said to be destroyed. I mean, it was amazing, and I've been able to ask the archives subsequently, why was that document open for me to see, and why was this one not destroyed? And they said changes of legislation since has changed the time where a document can be open. So apparently some of the original ones were meant to have been closed for 50 years, but were in the event closed for 30. So the very first thing we read in this Project X was by one of the escapers called Bob Kellogg Walker, who had talked to other escapers to create this document for the Air Ministry, where he says, you've asked me to try to summarise in 1 paragraph the escape. And he writes 3 pages instead, and says that's kind of the least he can write about this extraordinary thing. And at the end of it, in the last paragraph, he says, I hope that if anybody tells the story of this escape, they'll focus on the spirit and organisation of the escapers. And that was so valuable. That made us think, yeah, that's the story we need to tell them. The spirit of these people who were using this escape partly to keep their morale up because they needed to survive these years in this prisoner of war camp, and partly because they needed to know they were carrying on fighting for the people back home who needed them to win this war, and the people all over the world that needed it to happen. But that spirit that was also about camaraderie and collaboration and international collaboration. And the organisation, one of the reasons it was such a success was about 600 people were involved in making it work. And they kept it all top secret. How can nowadays we say even if 3 people have got a secret, it's no secret. But how can 600 people manage to keep what they were doing from the guards who were watching them so closely all day, every day? An amazing thing. And using people's natural talents. So a lot of the documents, the next document we looked at was the camp history, which told us about all the day-to-day life, about the showers and the water going off in the morning and the food that they were given, their allowance, their rations, but also told us about the different departments of Organisation X, the forgery department, where the artists would work to create passports and travel IDs, and the map department, where they'd get a map and be able to reproduce versions of it, having invented an amazing jelly press to print it, and the acquisitions department that would engage in bribery and bartering, and all these different departments that would come together under the chair, really, of the escape committee. So that was an amazing document. And then there was a whole set of documents which were reports from the Swiss Red Cross, who were the neutral nation that both parties had agreed would come in every 6 months to check over the camp. And their emphasis was very much on physical and mental health and well-being. And so we learned a lot in those documents about sports and sports fields. And the Germans had to ensure that there were adequate sports facilities and equipment and so on, some of which was purloined and turned into escape material. But a lot of it was also about keeping fit enough to be able to escape and keeping your head straight to be able to survive. And also one of the things we learned in these Red Cross documents was that the prisoners had a theatre. They had a fully fitted theatre with raked seating and lights on loan from Berlin and costumes. And they performed these amazing shows, including the review Girls, Girls, Girls. And the photos of that, they looked stunning. So they were fascinating documents. The other 2 sets of documents we looked at were actually very distressing. And I personally didn't look at those because they were accounts of the shootings and the interrogations subsequently. And those are the documents that were marked to be destroyed but hadn't been destroyed. So it was just this treasure trove of surprises, real surprises. I mean, who would have guessed that they would have an acrobatic troupe called the Royal Raviolis, and they would be taught by a camp guard who was an ex-circus performer how to tie themselves in and counterweight themselves to do a comedy circus routine.
When you're looking, you show there's 600 plus men involved in the escape process. They're aiming to get 200 out, and I think there's even a reserve list of. I knew one of the escapers, Frank Stone, and I think his escape number was something like 222. So he said I was unlikely to get out, but if 22 people fell out before me, I was potentially in there. How do you choose when you're putting together a play? Do you have a central protagonist, or do you have to? You can't have a cast of 200. Each with their little part.
I know, it's interesting. We sort of have got a cast of 600, interestingly. We knew that we'd have a cast of 9 actors, and so we'd have to, as you say, make some choices. And we knew that amongst those, we wanted there to be somebody who escaped and got home. There were 3 choices on that front. We knew that we'd want there to be somebody who escaped and was shot, somebody who didn't manage to escape, and somebody who chose not to, who chose to stay but just carry on supporting the escape. And also we wanted to tell the story of some of the German collaborators and the nemesis and so on. So we'd originally decided that each actor would play an ally and a German, but actually it was too many characters to have in the mix, even if the writers couldn't keep hold of it all. And also we originally said these will be real people, they will be the stories of the real people. But we couldn't really carry that through without not telling quite a bit of the story. We had to create kind of amalgamate certain things that different people did into one character. And we were determined that we wouldn't have a central protagonist, just because the whole thing was such an important collaborative effort. But I suppose that it does come out a little bit that Big X, the chair of the escape committee, who in real life was Roger Bushell in our play, is called Ballard, and is not an entirely accurate version of him, but does combine some elements of people who were in that position or similar roles. So, because a lot of it is his brilliant genius organisation of it, I think that does come out as a bit of a shaping character, but also so does the person who makes the home run. Spoiler alert. But then but that's only accounts for 591 of the people who were involved in the escape. So but luckily Theatre in the Round is a really engaging way to make a piece of theatre that really includes an audience. And so some of our front row audience members get to become people who run various departments that contribute to the escape. And that's really fantastic.
I was going to ask you about Theatre in the Round. Does it actually make it difficult, or is there a way to flip it into a huge opportunity? Because it's not usually what people, that's where the audience is sitting around the round the plays. It's played out for those who haven't quite cottoned on.
Yeah, a bit of both actually. It is a challenge because you can't move in loads of sets and stuff, but it does mean that you have to ask the audience to use their imagination. So when you're doing a play that starts in an aircraft above occupied Europe and then goes into a prison camp and then goes 30 feet down in the prison camp and has a whole scene under the ground and then goes all off across occupied Europe, that's quite useful. And also, the play's surprisingly funny. I think the thing that people have really remarked on about it is they weren't expecting it to be so funny. We've been very careful about it. It's very important. It's respectful and honours that contribution. But the guys themselves were making sure that they had fun because that's how they kept themselves going. And I think we've kind of brought a little bit of that into the play. And the Round is fantastic for something that's fun and funny. But the Round is also really dynamic. So for what's really an adventure, an amazing, thrilling, edge-of-your-seat adventure, it's a really fantastic way to make a piece of theatre because you see the audience tense and you hear them gasp at various moments at things they weren't expecting that happened as we tell the story. So it's a really, really great format, and it's really exciting that in London they're turning Alexandra Palace into a theatre in the round for the first time for us. And again, we went to Alexandra Palace to have a look at how it would be set up. And somebody there said, "Oh, did you know this was a prisoner of war camp in the First World War? Look, there's the graffiti on the wall." And the prisoners who were using it were using the theatre to make shows to keep their morale up, just in exactly the same way as these guys in Style Like a Three were. It's incredible, isn't it?
It is incredible, and we rarely ever think of German prisoners of war in Britain, especially during the First World War. And what I find funny is, and I've forgotten all the films, the connection you're making between the theatre productions that they put on and you're doing a theatre production. And what I also find extremely funny, if you start watching movies, as going back as far as the First World War, even French movies, there's a thing about British men getting dressed up as women. I try to think, and it's gone right out of my head. There's a French film set in a prisoner of war camp, and during the theatre production, the British men all come on, and their part is dressed as women, and the French all find it hilarious.
That's interesting that maybe it's a uniquely British thing, because, we've seen a lot of photos, and our sound designer, Alex Day, his granddad was in a camp, and he's got his granddad's photo album from that time, and his granddad was a theatre maker, and the album is just full of photos of, well, you wouldn't know they were men dressed as women. They're so authentic. They look, it's not drag or anything. We saw a letter from somebody who explained just how it made people feel normal for a night to be watching one of these shows. Once more, we felt we were in the presence of women, he said. And it was clearly so important as part of a moment of freedom and liberation from the normal day.
When you've done early showings or you've read it through the cast, have you found it difficult for people to sort of move away from their potential preconceptions if they've watched the film, or if they think they know what about the Second World War was, and you had to go, no, actually this bit that you think might be fantastical or wrong is true? Do people come with loaded judgment that you're having to challenge?
What an interesting question, because now you say it, I think, yeah, of course, one would expect that, but I haven't found that to be the case. I think it's because we've, right at the beginning, put out the records and said, look, this is the stuff we found. And we also listened quite a lot to the Imperial War Museum's digital archive. In the early 21st century and the late 20th, they did a massive programme of interviewing survivors of the escape, very elderly men, and these incredible voices of these quite weak and very elderly people remembering this life-changing experience, but also talking about anecdotal details, stuff that you wouldn't probably write down if you were writing it. So I think that as people joined the project, had a tremendous respect for those real people and the real records, and really a drive to tell the real story. So only very occasionally there's a moment where our records show that one of our escapers was given a push bike and did quite a deal of escaping across France on a push bike. And at one moment somebody said, do you know, this is a little bit like the bit in the movie? But nobody at any point said, well, are we not going to have the jump, the bike jump? I think everybody knows that that's the construct now. So I think people have been really, really accepting, really positive about the fact that it's all from the archives, actually, and that we've been very rigorous about scrutinising it. We can't say that because that can't be evidence. You know?
I was going to add to that, though, but do you find yourself, because it is 80 years after the event, having to write a lot of exposition for people who don't know?
No, it is amazing, actually, how the legend lives on, really, and even people who actually know nothing about it do sort of know, you know, could tell you in one sentence roughly what it might be. It's been brilliant seeing lots of young people coming in to see it. People have been bringing their 11 and 12-year-olds, and they can't know much about it. And it's been just fantastic. And a group of teenagers from a sixth form college I was sitting opposite a couple of weeks ago. It's amazing to see them gasping and oohing and ahhing. And I guess they can't have known much about it. But I think people do know it's a legend and that it's important.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those stories that's so fantastical that if it wasn't true, you'd think it was just some Hollywood fiction. And that actually makes the story really gripping. Well, I was in our email exchange, I pointed out that Operation Mincemeat's playing in London. And you said, oh, there's Jack Absolute Flies Again's playing. And I wonder if there is renewed interest potentially in the Second World War. Does it offer something that fits our current time, or is it just a coincidence?
Do you know what? I think it might be a bit of both. I know that we started this play. Our trip to the archives was in September 2019. And we'd been talking about it for a few months before, but that's when we started working on it. And there was a moment in April 2020 where the writers and I were sitting on Zoom writing, saying, oh, here we are all locked up, writing about these people who are locked up. And then as it went on, the pandemic went on, it did feel more and more relevant, really, that we were in this global crisis, writing a play about a global crisis. And then, of course, Ukraine as well, that started to make us think again about war and conflict. It's given the play a much more serious edge. I think it would have had that anyway, but I think it might have been a historical serious edge, whereas it's got quite a contemporary serious edge. The things we found out about the Geneva Convention, these rules of war that I didn't know existed, and also about the Red Cross. And one of our team offered a home to a Ukrainian and went from rehearsal where they'd been doing a song called Red Cross Swing in the morning to the airport, and were met by the Red Cross in the afternoon. And again, we've been talking to the Red Cross about use of the logo, which they're very protective about. And again, we've just come out with such respect for what that organisation does and has done, and how it kept those guys alive, really, and the changes it continues to make today. So it has felt really relevant. And I think, as you say, maybe those plays that are about the Second World War, maybe there is a little bit of a sort of feeling, how did people respond to a global crisis, and what can we learn from that to cope better with the one we're in? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think is that sort of people keep waffling on about the Blitz spirit, which always slightly annoys me because I'm not completely sure there was a Blitz spirit at the time of the Blitz because it was probably all for itself. But there is an idea of everyone being together and everyone in it together, and there's elements of, and I don't necessarily directly mean nationalism, but there is that kind of we're all in it together as a nation kind of thing. And I wondered if there was something in that, and look at our we're trying once more to find our place in the world, I guess, post-Brexit, I think. And I wondered if it sort of, the Second World War somehow fits into that.
Yeah, and as I say, what I found so inspiring was the international effort that we discovered that war was about that I hadn't realised. You've reminded me one of the other things we discovered that I was really surprised at, and it's this idea about propaganda and myths. I was so surprised to discover how ideologically opposed to the Nazi regime quite a lot of the German guards were, including the commandant of the camp. And actually, I think that helped the escapers a great deal. But I didn't realise that either, that people were not loud about it, but really quite opposed to Nazism. It's interesting.
And I suspect that you probably find the camp guards are the older guys who've not gone through the German system, so they're slightly more immune and being neutral.
Yeah, and actually some of them on this particular gig, and that's a terrible way to describe it, isn't it? Some of them with giving that particular job or taking it because they wanted to be out on the edge of things and not actually be able to be taking an active role.
Yeah. So I haven't really got any more questions, but I met Frank Stone, this for Second World War Great Escaper. Have you bumped into the story of Frank?
No, I don't think I've come across his name actually.
Frank was one of the last left alive. He was one of the last 4 left alive. Frank's really funny though, because Frank in the 70s he did a public speaking course. He worked for the Ministry of Agriculture. He did a public speaking course. And to pass it, he had to give his talks. He thought, well, I'll do it on the Great Escape. And his daughter ran the local young farmers, said, oh, Dad, can you give the speech? He went, okay. So from the 70s until his death about 10 years ago, Frank had given the same speech and raised about £60,000. The funny thing about Frank was he never qualified. He should have never been on a plane. He was waiting to be shipped to Canada to fly, to get his flight training. And someone said, oh, Frank, we're a gunner shot. Do you want to just sit in? We're just flying over the Atlantic. Okay. So they did that. And then he's still back at base waiting again. And they said, oh, we've got another easy milk one. Do you want to come with us? He went, okay. And that's when they were shot down. And when they said crash positions, he said, I had to tap the fella next to me. He said, what do I have to do? He said, no one told me what crash positions were. So Frank crashes, and his job, he was in the, I've forgotten which is which is Tom, Dick and Harry, which is the one that ever gets out. Frank was in that hut, and his job, there was 2 of them on it, was to sweep the hut to make sure no soil could be seen. That was the whole of 2 men's job for the Great Escape. And he did this talk, and it's like a 90-minute talk, and he would just talk about, oh yeah, we got and this is how, and you'd have a little bowl of water, this is how you cut glass to make compasses. And this is how they cut the wood to make the tunnel to do and that's all he talked, because his was such a minute bit. He just talked about what he did in his tiny, tiny part in this bigger thing. Did Frank. And he was hugely enthusiastic, but he had we filmed him doing his talk, and then interviewed after him. And one of the last things he said was, I don't really know why anybody's interested. Because he says, well, I was such a small part. But Frank, it's such a small part, but you shouldn't have been there to start with. You shouldn't have been on the flipping plane to start with.
It's amazing, wasn't it? And so young. And he was in Hut 104, which is the Harry Hut. That's one of the things, actually, I know now that the film did differently. They escaped from, I think, through the wash hut in the film. Whereas actually the escape took place under the stove in Hut 104, which was Frank's hut. And you know what? Somebody turned up during the run of the show from America and said to us afterwards, my dad was in Hut 104 and didn't get to escape.
But he was completely baffled why anyone was interested in him, because as he said, I didn't escape, I just swept the hut. But his talk was brilliant because it is just about these nothing details that no one talks about, just about doing things with tins, and it's not the great sweep of history, it's those really day-to-day bits that Frank waffled on about.
But that's why we admire those escapers so much, I think, their ingenuity in having next to nothing and being able to fashion a saw out of a spring that they took out of a gramophone and be able to use that to notch the bedboards and to discover that those bedboards were going to provide the shoring for this feat of engineering, a 300-foot long tunnel And to do that from the materials that they could find that the camp guards wouldn't notice.
And it's the weird way they cut the bedboards to slip inside so they physically can't move once they're... And you're like, someone's just sat there. And I guess it's the product of boredom. Well, if we do that, yeah, but if we cut it like this, we could do that. Oh, yeah, but we could... And it's just... there's nothing else to do, presumably. Do you just sit and come up with these completely harebrained, random ideas?
And they had the skill. No, didn't they? I mean, out of all those men, because of course they're all there because they're aircrew, but before they were aircrew, they all had jobs and crafts in civilian life, and the tailors are there making those civilian clothes so that people won't be noticed when they're out trying to escape and looking like businessmen, and the engineers and the miners are there knowing how to shore up and how to dig, and the forgers knowing how to forge somebody's signature, and amazing that they brought all those skills to bear.
Well, Theresa, thank you, and good luck. I'm sure you'll be playing to packed houses every night. Loyal listener, Tom, Dick and Harry is running at the Alexandra Palace Theatre in London until the end of August 2022. I will put a link on the website. I hope you found that interesting. Normal service will be resumed with the next episode when I'm joined once more by John Trigg to discuss the Battle of Stalingrad. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.